there's much teaching of the wrong sort about this passage, about heaping the hot coals on your enemy's head. Pastors are uncomfortable with this, and so they made up something that doesn't make any sense at all to explain it. So we might as well look at it and make good sense of it. Romans 12:17, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, meaning give place to God's wrath. Let God avenge you, not you avenge yourself. Because it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So he says, now if you avenge yourself, you don't give God any room to come in and avenge you. And he does it more fairly. He does it more in a more timely way. He does it in a more, God does it the right way. When we avenge ourselves, that means we're getting revenge on somebody. We probably are not in our most rational state of mind when we're seeking vengeance. But God is always in a rational state of mind, and he will always avenge correctly. So he says, don't avenge yourselves. Let God do that. Leave room for him to do it. Because he has said, he's promised, vengeance is mine. It's not yours. It's not your privilege to avenge yourself. It's God's privilege and responsibility. And he says, so don't do it yourself. Then he says, and from this he's quoting from the Proverbs. Proverbs 25, verse 21 and 22. He says, therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. This is your enemy. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What's it mean to heap coals of fire on his head? Paul is saying to do good things to your neighbor, but actually he's quoting Solomon. These are Old Testament commands. You know, when people say, well, the Old Testament said we should hate your enemy, but the New Testament says you should love your enemy. No, it doesn't. The Old Testament doesn't say to hate your enemy. The law itself in Exodus said if you see the ox of the man who hates you has escaped and is wandering around, take it back to him. If you see the donkey of your enemy fallen under foot, help it up. This is your enemy's donkey. Help him anyway. The Old Testament says we should love our enemies too. Maybe not the nation's enemies. They weren't told to love the Canaanites in their wars, but enemies, personal enemies. Now, Solomon said, if you do good to somebody who hates you, you feed your enemy when he's hungry, you clothe him when he's naked, you give him drink when he's thirsty, you are heaping hot coals of fire on his head. In the context of doing good to your enemy, preachers have tried to make sense of this by saying, there must be something about heaping coals of fire on the head that's better than it sounds. And so what they say, and I've heard this more places than I can remember. In fact, every preacher I've ever heard talk about this says this. In those days, you know, people didn't have matches. They couldn't make fires easily. So the whole community, the village, would have a bonfire. They'd bank the coals at night. And in the morning, the women would go out to the bonfire, gather coals, and take them back to their house for their ovens to bake their bread and things like that. Now, of course, in the Middle East, people carried things on their heads. The women carried these things in pots on their heads. So they put these coals in a pot and put it on their head and carry it home. And you could do them a favor by helping them up with it. You know, I mean, help them keep the coals of fire on their head, which is a favor you're doing them because they want to do that anyway, and you're just giving them a hand. Now, that's always seemed like a very stupid explanation to me. For this very reason, why give that as an explanation of what you're doing? If Solomon is saying you're doing a good deed to them, then why pick that particular strange thing as a good deed, which is ambiguous at the very best? But more than that, it'd be nonsensical. He'd be saying essentially, feed him when he's hungry, give him drink when he's thirsty, because then you're doing a good thing to him. Well, yeah, obviously. Do you need to be told that? You don't need to tell someone that you're doing a good deed for someone when they do that. And why compare it with the particular good deed of loading a bunch of coals? No, Paul sees it as an example of you don't avenge yourself. God will avenge you. You're leaving vengeance to God. Now, your enemy is someone that if he's hungry, you could say, oh, good. You deserve it. Go to someone else. I don't have any interest in you. You're my enemy. That's me avenging myself. But he says, no, feed them. Be friendly to him. Love him. Love your enemy. And what you're doing then is leaving room for God's vengeance. You're heaping up the coals on that person's head. That is, by the way, hot coals in the Bible is always a reference to judgment. What you're doing is you're increasing their guilt by not punishing them for their bad deeds that they've done to you. If someone does something bad to you and you do something bad to them, okay, the slate is clean. Nothing left for God to do. But if someone does bad to you and you do good to them, then there is something left for God to do. God said, I'll avenge. Let me do it. And that vengeance of God is the hot coals. They haven't fallen yet, but they're hanging over his head. It says in John chapter 3, the very last verse, it says, he that believeth not on the Son of God, the wrath of God abides upon him. He's walking around with a Damocles sword hanging over his head that could pop any time, come down and pop him. The idea is that person is accumulating greater judgment from God by you not, letting the air out of that balloon. If he's bad to you and you're bad to him, okay, there's nothing left to be done. But if you're good to him when he's done bad to you, there is something left to be done. And the more good you do to him, the more remains for God to do to him. And he's accumulating. When that judgment comes, it'll be more because you've done good instead of bad to him. Now, does this mean do good to him because you're really trying to hurt him? No. It's saying do good to him. God will take care of the vengeance that is owed. And let God decide how much that person is owed. Don't you do it yourself. If you try to take matters into your own hands, you're likely to overdo it or do it wrong. Leave it with God. The accumulation of the hot coals on his head is the accumulation of the wrath of God that will come upon him at the time that God takes the vengeance he promises to take. And that's what that's referring to. Elijah was in the town of Dothan, and the Syrians were sent soldiers to kill him, to arrest him and kill him. And when they came to the gate, Elisha met them, and he struck them blind. And then he led them blind to the king in Samaria. And when the king saw these enemy soldiers were there, the king said, what shall I do, Elisha? Shall I slay them with the sword? And Elisha said, no, give them a meal and send them home. Here, these people had come to kill Elisha, and he says, well, host them at your table. Give them food. They're hungry. Send them on their way in peace. I mean, that's doing good to your enemy. But the Syrians did come under God's judgment. The point here is that when judgment is owed to somebody who's done something to you, there's two ways you can go about it. You can kind of ignore it, do good to them, treat them as if they weren't your enemy, knowing that, well, this will be settled. It's not like they're getting away with something. I think this is the thing. When we get angry at somebody or when we do something unkind to somebody who's done something wrong to us, we feel like, I have to do this or else they're getting away with it. No, they're not getting away with anything. There's a judgment. There's vengeance. As you're not the administrator of it, you allow that to accumulate upon them, and God will take care of it. Now, of course, you don't want that to fall on them, but that's something you don't have power over. That's God. God governs his universe. He's going to judge the wicked. You're not trying to do them harm, but you're leaving it to God to decide just how much harm and when it should come, rather than taking it into your own hands and making that decision yourself.